What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video on the channel. Today, we're going to be going over our playoff predictions for the NFL. As you guys saw at the beginning of the season, we had our season-long predictions, so there's going to be a few differences from then until now. We'll also go over those at the end of the year, so we will have a video going over the MVP and all the other awards like that. But for now, we're just going to go over our playoff predictions. And starting off, we'll start off in the AFC. We'll go from the highest seed to the lowest. So starting off in the wild card round, we have the Bills and the Steelers. How do we feel about this matchup?
Yeah, and to be honest, this is probably the least inspiring wild card matchup. The Bills obviously have been on a really hot streak, and the Steelers kind of lucked their way into the playoffs. Mason Rudolph is still probably one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL, but he's brought this team to the playoffs, and it's really been on the backs of Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, emerging as a really good running back duo, which I think we saw a little bit, but probably didn't expect to be a playoff worthy one. The Bills have had a weird season. They started strong, middle, they were very, very bad, and then they make some coaching changes and they end the season winning 5 straight. The Bills defense has looked great, especially against the run. I mentioned the highlight of this Pittsburgh team is their running attack, and the Bills have exactly what it takes to counter that. I know Josh Allen's been having some high turnover games, but still looks like one of the best quarterbacks in the league. The Bills are better all around, and I think that's going to be reflected in the score. I think the Bills make easy work of this game.
Yeah, and going into this game, it is a 10-point spread, so it makes sense there with the highest seed matchup in the AFC. And like you said, Josh Allen, I mean, he's thrown a pick in all but 3 games this season, and they've won, I mean, their past 5 matchups, they've won 6 out of their last 7. The only loss in that time frame coming against Philadelphia in overtime, and a very tough game there. But Josh Allen is a quarterback where these past few years, a lot of people have different opinions if he's a really an elite guy. And I think he's kind of right on that border. I think, as we'll see later, I don't want to spoil too much, but I think this Bills team is good enough to get past this first round against the Steelers. I think it could be a little closer than some people expect if Josh Allen is to throw those turnovers, just because the Steelers team can capitalize in some instances. But if both teams have the same amount of possessions, I'm going to take the Bills easily in this game.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to be tough with TJ Watt being sidelined. We just got confirmed today that he's not going to be in that game. So we're looking good for the Bills offense. But on to the next matchup, one that's pretty exciting and looked like two of the best teams in the AFC earlier this year. Both have kind of skidded into this game. It's the Chiefs versus the Dolphins. It's going to be an Arrowhead. How do you think this game's going to go?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting game to look at because both of these teams, if you were to tell me that they both ended with the same record throughout this whole season, I would be very surprised because the Dolphins have looked very good. But there's obviously been some times where they haven't looked that great either. They played each other this year in, I believe it was in Germany. The Chiefs came away with the win, so we could see a similar result in that sense. I think both of these teams have definitely had their ups and downs this year. The Chiefs going through a hard stretch, and the Dolphins also going through one. But I think if I have to pick a team in this game, it's going to be a pretty close game right now. I believe that we have the spread at 3.5 for the Chiefs. I think it could be even closer than that, but I can't bet against Mahomes. I know that he's going to be able to go out there and make some Mahomey plays. I'm sure some guys will be able to step up. Rashee Rice has been great throughout the past, I guess, just this whole season. He kind of started off a little slow, but the past few weeks, especially towards those fantasy playoffs, those weeks, he was great. It just really depends on how these receivers play. I think they're good enough to get past this first round, but it is going to be tough for them after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this game, I think this really shows the downfall of Miami just because I think they're a great team. I do think they could win this game. But in all honesty, this was a team that should have been having a home playoff game. And now they have to go on the road into Arrowhead. Snow is going to be a huge factor. Obviously, Tua is a guy that's playing in the warm weather his whole career. And he's a guy that likes to air it out. And I know Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane have had great years. I think individually, both of them have pretty spectacular running back abilities just in general. I mean, they're good players, don't get me wrong, but the Dolphins offense is at their best when Tyreek Hill is stretching the field. And whether it be by design, I know Tua loves to go with this first read. Tyreek Hill is arguably the offensive player of the year. And when he's playing up on the biggest stage, making big plays, that's how the Dolphins win this game. I say all that to say, I think the Chiefs are the team that's going to take that away. Their secondaries looked really good this year, and their defense is sneakily a top 3, top 5 unit in football. It's going to be cold. Tua's really going to have to make some plays that I don't think he's comfortable making. And overall, I mean, you're a Chiefs team with Patrick Mahomes on the offensive unit. I think they win that game at home. I don't think the Chiefs are at full strength like we've seen the last couple of years, but they're good enough to beat this Dolphins team, who I still think is a step or two away from actually competing.
Yeah, and even on the opposite end, on the Dolphins, they're definitely dealing with some injuries. We just saw Bradley Chubb get hurt, Jalen Phillips too, in that same area too, and they also have guys too like Jalen Waddle. If Jalen Waddle doesn't play, he's questionable right now, and it's just Tyreek Hill out there as the number one receiver against the Chiefs. It's going to be very hard just because they should be able to stop him more, since they'll be able to double team him. Even though that Dolphins team is pretty solid, both teams definitely dealing with injury, and it's going to be a tough game. Just like you said, I think this should be probably one of the best games in the playoffs. I wouldn't be surprised if it came down to a final drive, but it's just going to come down to Tua. And if I'm betting against Tua or Mahomes, I would have to take Mahomes in this instance. Just like we saw in the national championship too. I know some people are calling Michael Penix Tua with a do-rag. I don't know. I mean, based on that last game, you can make your assumptions about that. But in the end, I think Mahomes will get past the Dolphins here. And like you said, it just kind of shows the downfall of the Dolphins. One of the contenders at the beginning of the year, people were saying Tua should win the MVP, but they've kind of crashed down to earth in these past few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to head to the next matchup. It's definitely a narrative driven playoffs, at least in the wild card round. And we're going to see the Browns take on the Texans in Houston. Obviously, Deshaun Watson will not be playing. We have Joe Flacco, who's kind of setting the world on fire right now. And this Browns defense has definitely stepped up to par as well. And obviously, on the Texans side, CJ Stroud having one of the most incredible rookie years we've seen from a quarterback in the modern era, arguably ever. So, a lot of narratives going into this one. Two teams that have surprised both of us throughout the year. Who do you think is coming out on top of this game?
Yeah, and looking at this game, the Browns are favored. It makes sense. The better team overall, they have the better defense. Joe Flacco has gone out and played well. I mean, Amari Cooper breaking that record a few weeks ago, 250 yards. But I am going to have to go with the Texans here, which I didn't think I would say at the beginning of the year. CJ Stroud has proven that he's the real deal. I know they're going to be out. They're not going to have Tank Dell in this game, but like we saw last week, Nico Collins went out there and had a massive performance. Noah Brown and Robert Woods are both questionable. They didn't practice this week. It's only Tuesday, so I think as long as both of them play, they should be fine. And we've definitely seen other guys emerge on that team overall. The Browns without their starting quarterback too as well, but it seems like that's just been the whole season for them now. Without Nick Chubb too, he's been out pretty much the whole season, and they're still in a position to be able to win a playoff game. So you can just see how good this team is built. And I think the story of Joe Flacco is cool. I think he could easily win this game too. I think it's going to be another very close game, but I think in the end, CJ Stroud is going to do everything he can to go out there and win this game. It would be a massive boost for a guy like him in his rookie season after having the best rookie quarterback season of all time. So it should be a close game, but I think the Texans are going to be able to edge them out.
Yeah, this was a very tough one for me to predict. Another game that looks to be very good in the AFC wild card. But with that being said, I've been down on the Browns all year. I've been kind of a hater. I've been very high on Houston all year as well. But I think that's going to have to change because Cleveland's going to travel to Houston. They're going up against CJ Stroud, who has looked good, but it's a rookie quarterback. And we saw one of these two teams matched up earlier this year. I know CJ Stroud wasn't playing, and that's a huge factor. But we saw Zadarius Smith and Myles Garrett attack that Houston O-line and just make a mess of everything that was going up on there. Cleveland definitely has the advantage at defense. And when it comes to Houston, I've liked how their defense has stepped up. Obviously, Will Anderson Jr., arguably the defensive rookie of the year, but their secondary is towards the bottom of the league. I know that with Joe Flacco and Amari Cooper building that connection, not to mention David Njoku, who's a top 5 tight end in football right now, they're going to try to go deep. I don't know if Houston's secondary really has the guys in place to stop that. It's going to be a very good game. I think Stroud could cement himself a legacy if he goes out and beats this Browns team, but with their defense looking so strong and honestly, Cleveland just having these older vets such as Flacco who have been in this position before, it's going to be an uphill battle. I think Cleveland comes out on top.
Yeah, I think it should be a very close game. I think out of all the playoff games, I would assume this one probably be the closest. It should be a very good back-to-back battle. And like you said, they did play earlier in the season. CJ Stroud didn't play. And if you look at both of those teams in that game, I think it's kind of interesting looking how bad Houston played, that they really only lost by 2 touchdowns in the end. They still put up 22 points, even though it seemed like no one could really score. on that team. Andrew Beck and Nico Collins, the only scorers, and they combined for 24 receiving yards in that game. And they were still in it for most of the game. Amari Cooper had a career day, and the Browns won that game. But I think this definitely should be a very good game. The home field advantage, I think it would be a lot cooler if we got to see the Deshaun Watson homecoming against the Texans, a little bit more of a storyline game. But for now, both of these teams, very young teams too, with the Browns on the opposite end, they have a very good built up defense and great pieces on the offense. So both of these teams could easily be contenders in the future for a long time, just the way that they're built. But now we can bounce over to the NFC wildcard games, starting off with the Cowboys and the Packers. I'll give my prediction really quickly. I'm kind of surprised that the Packers ended up making the playoffs based on all the games that I've watched from Jordan Love this year. He's good. He had some good games, but there's definitely some times where he's struggled. And against this Dallas team, I think he's going to struggle a lot. I do think he's the quarterback of the future. And I know a lot of people are kind of taking that 7.5 points for Green Bay, but from what I've seen in most of Dallas's games this year, they may not be the greatest going up against good teams, but I wouldn't consider the Packers really that great of a team. I think they should be able to steamroll through them.
Yeah, I love Jordan Love. I'm very high on him. I think he's absolutely Green Bay's quarterback of the future. But with that being said, you bring up good points, not to mention the Packers are one of the youngest teams in the whole league. They have guys that might not be ready for the playoff atmosphere, especially one as big as Dallas. We'll talk about Dallas plenty of times more of this video. They're a team that has been called fraudulent. They're teams that have crumbled in big moments, but there's no doubt that they have the energy and they have the talent to absolutely steamroll a team like Green Bay. I think when it comes down to it, you're taking Jordan Love versus the Cowboys defense, and I do not like that at all for Green Bay. And then you're taking Dak Prescott and what he's done with this Cowboys offense. Obviously, CeeDee Lamb having one of the best receiving seasons we've seen in a long time against the Packers defense. I like Jair Alexander. I know he's been in the news a lot, but CeeDee Lamb is an absolute matchup nightmare for any cornerback, no matter how good, not to mention the other weapons they have for Dallas. I think this was probably the game in wild card round where I like the favorite the most. I think the Cowboys make pretty easy work of this, and I just think we should be applauding Jordan Love for getting the Packers here in the first place, and I think they have a lot to build on after this, but it's definitely not their year.
Yeah, and next up in the NFC, we're going to have the Detroit Lions, the 3 seed this year, going up against the Rams. The Rams, another team where started the season off very hot. A lot of people say that they were contenders for this year, end up making the playoffs, a tough stretch over the middle of the season, but they end up making the playoffs here. The only problem is they're going up against the Lions, who have been great pretty much all year. One win away from being an even higher seed. As we know, that game against the Cowboys, which I think both of these teams getting business done. We could see a rematch in the playoffs between those two teams. And I think the Lions have a lot to prove in the playoffs. Going up against Matthew Stafford going back to Detroit in this game, another kind of revenge matchup for him. I wouldn't say revenge in a sense, just because he got traded. He was there long enough. I don't think there's really any bad blood between them. I would be surprised if Matthew Stafford got booed in Detroit, but I think going into this game, the Lions just better from top to bottom. A lot of the guys on the Rams have been good this year. Obviously, Puka Nacua coming out, having a good season. Kyron Williams having a good season. Matthew Stafford playing well. But when we're talking about the two game manager quarterbacks between Jared Goff and Matthew Stafford, I think Jared Goff is just better right now if you look at the stats. And David Montgomery has been fantastic this year too. Amon-Ra, pretty good compared to a guy like Nacua. I would say a little bit better, even though he didn't make the Pro Bowl. These teams are very comparable if you really break down the players on these teams. And I just think with these teams built so similarly, the Lions have some younger guys. I think they're just going to be able to get after it and get this win.
Yeah, this is a tough one. Going into the season, I was super low on the Rams. They were like a 4-win team for me, and they've really looked like one of the stronger units in the NFL, especially recently. So I was way off. I think the Rams and the Lions should be especially nervous. Their fans should be nervous because the matchups, as you mentioned, are really close. They're kind of insane. The Lions' run defense is great, but so is Kyron Williams. Aaron Donald and Kobe Turner are an awesome inside duo, but so are Ragnow and Jackson for Detroit's offensive line. And the Rams defense can create pressure, but Jared Goff is really good against the blitz. So it feels like everything kind of cancels each other out. So with that being said, without a huge statistical difference between the two, I think it's going to come down to experience. And there's something about Stafford coming back to Detroit for the first time with a team made up of guys that are ready to roll that I think is going to work. I mean, you got to remember this team does have Cooper Cup, it does have Puka Nakua. These are guys that could torch that Lions defense if it comes down to it. The game could just come down to whoever has the ball last, and if that's the Rams, I do agree that Jared Goff is a better quarterback, but I trust Matthew Stafford to make that game-winning drive in the playoffs. I'm going to take the Rams playing upset against the Lions, and I think a very good Lions season that can't go unnoticed. I think it ends early, and I think the Rams handle business.
Yeah, I guess our first kind of big upset here with the 6th seed with the Rams. I think it's a very good game that we'll be in for. I think pretty much all of these games should be a good game. Even the Bills and the Steelers game, I think, could be pretty close. The only game that I really don't see being that close, the Cowboys and the Packers. But I mean, that could still be a close game too. Going off in the next game, the 4 and the 5 seed, the Bucks and the Eagles. We saw these teams play in the wild card a few years ago when Tom Brady was there, and the Bucks came out with the victory. The Eagles have just completely fallen apart in the end of this season, and if you had to tell me that the Bucks would be playing the Eagles at the beginning of the season in the wild card game, I would easily be like, "Oh, this is a 2-7 matchup, not the Bucks getting home field advantage." And the Eagles have just looked absolutely terrible throughout the last few weeks. They have a lot of injuries going into this game. AJ Brown got hurt last week. Pretty much all of the receiving core got hurt. Jalen Hurts got hurt. So it's a very tough game because looking at both of these teams, Baker Mayfield has been fantastic this year. I think he has not got nearly enough credit. I think he's definitely one of the contenders for comeback player of the year. Especially looking last year, what we saw with a guy like Geno Smith, he won the award, and Baker Mayfield having a pretty identical season in that sense, making the playoffs, bringing this team back up, a very good statistical season. And I don't know where to go with this prediction just because the Eagles clearly the better team, but missing so many players. And even if they play, this team doesn't look like they like each other. AJ Brown has been vocal pretty much every single week, yelling at all these players, yelling at Jalen Hurts because he's wide open. I think it's going to be a very ugly game for the Eagles, and I'm going to go with the Bucks here.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me one bit. And it's easy to be down on the Eagles right now, considering how bad they've been the last couple of weeks. They have a lot of things to figure out this year, but I don't think we should go that overboard. The Buccaneers are not necessarily a very good team either. And I agree, Baker Mayfield's had a really good year. Comeback player of the year is definitely in his grasp. I think he's a good candidate. And he is a little shaken up as well. I know Jalen Hurts is hurt, but you got to remember this game is on Monday, whether that, be the NFL script or not. These teams are going to have an extra day to heal up and be ready to roll. And I do think the Eagles are still the better team. They've looked really bad, but the Buccaneers haven't been setting the world on fire either. They kind of coast into here, beating the Panthers 9-0. Their offense isn't really clicking. And I just see Philly dominating up front. One thing about the Eagles is they have looked really bad recently, but their O-line has not been the problem. And I don't think their D-line has been either. They have still looked good on those ends. And they have a fire under them. They obviously come in on the road going to Tampa Bay. And I think they need to beat a Buccaneers team who is worse than them. I understand the narrative definitely goes Tampa Bay's way, but Philly is still the better team, and I think they have something to prove, and I think they will go out and prove that on Monday. So I know Tampa's a popular upset pick. I understand with Philly kind of stumbling into the finish, they could definitely get knocked out early. I do think they're better than Tampa Bay, and I think that will be shown in this game.
Yeah, I think this game is really going to come down to what the score is at halftime. I think if the Eagles are losing at halftime and a lot is going wrong, I don't know if this team is going to be able to rally up in the locker room and be able to go out there and actually perform and get everyone going. I mean, looking at the stats this year, Baker Mayfield, more yards than Jalen Hurts passing, more touchdowns, less interceptions. And then I know there's going to be all the comments, bring in the rushing stats, and maybe we'll see Jalen Hurts do his tush push every play and maybe get some yards with that. But if we look at this, DeAndre Swift, Devontae Smith, Jalen Hurts, all questionable. I'm sure most, if not all of them, will be able to play, but there's just been a lot going on too. And both of these teams, I mean, 1 yard touchdown merchants with Mike Evans on one side and Jalen Hurts on the other side. So we just got to see who can spread the ball more around the field because once we know both of these teams in the red zone, they're going to score. But until then, I think this is going to be a very competitive game. And if it does end up raining, it's going to add even more to it just because we're looking at two teams that haven't really run the ball that much this year. DeAndre Swift is a very good back, but production wise, 5 touchdowns, 1,000 yards on the season, which isn't terrible, but you would assume with 250 plus almost 250 carries, he would be able to get more stats up. But in the end, I guess it just comes down to them not running the ball in the red zone. But it should be a very close game, and if it rains, it should be a sloppy game. And in the end, it's just going to really come down to who gets these turnovers and who can actually capitalize on them.
Yeah, and one more thing I want to add about that game, because it is the one where we do have a disagreement on. There's been a couple of those. When we saw Philly and Tampa Bay matchup earlier this season, obviously we were looking at a different Philly team. But Philly did come out on top of that game, and what they did was control the ball for almost the entire clock. It was something ridiculous. Like, they had the ball 80% of the game. And I think if it does rain and it is like that, I kind of expect Philly to win even more. So there's a lot of factors that come in. We have seen guys like Rachaad White in the backfield for Tampa Bay. He's been disappointing this year, but he has had some really big games. If the ball is on the ground, he could have one of those. So it really could go either way. But with that being said, let's kick it back over to the AFC. This is going to get a little confusing for you guys, maybe, but we're going to have different matchups. So we'll start in the AFC divisional. Obviously, we're both going to have the Ravens that get the first round bye. I believe you have them going up against the Texans. How do you feel like that game's going to go?
I think both of these teams should be very good in the playoffs this year. I know Lamar Jackson has definitely struggled in the playoffs, but this Ravens team has been fantastic from top to bottom throughout the whole entire season. Going into the game against San Francisco, I remember feeling very confident about the game just because this Ravens team just looked very different this year. Lamar Jackson going to win the MVP. Sorry for the spoilers, but if you're a minus 20,000 favorite, you're winning the MVP this year. And I expected out of all these teams, I remember when we had our preseason predictions, we spent pretty much half the video talking about this division just because we expected pretty much every single team to have a winning record and make the playoffs. And the Bengals were the one team that didn't make the playoffs, which very interesting in the end. I know they had a lot of injuries, but this whole entire Ravens team has been fantastic this year. I think this is kind of where the end of the road comes for the Texans. The Ravens, just a better team overall, and CJ Stroud, his weapons that he has offensively just really aren't that great in the end. I think they're good enough to get by in one game, but this is a matchup that I think with the way that the Chiefs are on a little bit of a downfall, the way that the Bills kind of snuck into that 2 seed at the end of the season. I mean, they easily could have been the 6 seed if they lost that game or almost missed the playoffs, depending on how scenario. I think we could definitely see a Ravens and Texans kind of AFC championship rivalry throughout the next 5 years, like we saw with the Bills and the Chiefs. But for now, I think the Ravens edge them out in this game. Lamar Jackson just a little bit better at this moment than CJ Stroud going on to win the MVP. But this should be a battle that we'll see within the next few years. Zay Flowers has been great for the Ravens. He immediately has become Lamar's #1 option, and he is kind of taking over that role as a Deebo Samuel kind of guy where he can run and also catch passes in the backfield. He's just been fantastic. This Ravens team, you can't say enough good things about them. Lamar coming back into form this year, going back and winning that MVP.
Yeah, and when we get to my divisional matchups, you'll see a theme. There's a lot of inter-division matchups as well, but I have the Ravens taking the Browns. As you mentioned, this AFC North, absolutely incredible this year, aside from the Bengals, who obviously missing Joe Burrow, had a lot of things go wrong. But if the Ravens play the Browns, they split the season series. They love to say it's hard to beat a team 3 times. They don't have to worry about all that. And at the end of the day, Baltimore just is the better team. A lot of things you mentioned, Zay Flowers emerging as a #1 target has made Lamar's job a lot easier. He's one of the best players in the league, and he's really just showing out this year. With that being said, the Ravens defense is probably the best in the league this year as well, and they're going to have extra time to prep for whoever they play. In my case, the Browns. And with Cleveland, they've seen them twice this year. They know what they like to do. And with Joe Flacco, I like the things that they do to a certain extent. I like how they throw the ball down the field. I like how Amari Cooper has built a connection with Flacco that I feel like he never built with Deshaun Watson. But at the end of the day, when does the magic stop? And it's kind of like like the CJ Stroud thing, obviously two different ends of the spectrum, one being a rookie, one being a vet who's probably going to be out the league and retired pretty soon. But regardless, I think the Ravens defense steps up, makes it an ugly game. I think their offense can obviously put up points in bunches. We saw them drop 50 multiple times this year. And with Lamar at the helm, I'd be very surprised if the Ravens don't at least win one playoff game. If it's against the Browns, I think it's pretty easy.
Yeah. Next up here with my matchup, I believe that we do have the same matchup here with the Bills and the Chiefs, the 2 and the 3 seed here. And this is a game that we pretty much expect to see every single year with Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen going against each other. We've seen it in Arrowhead most of the years. Now we're going in, we're going to have the game in New York. And I mean, we've seen this story throughout the past few years. The Bills came away with a win in the regular season, but in the end, it seems like Mahomes just always has the number of the Bills, and I can't go against that again this year.
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me at all. And in the past, I mean, as you mentioned, we've seen Kansas City own the Bills in the playoffs. We see it every single year, but I think that really comes down to the fact that Patrick Mahomes always seems to lead this team to game-winning drives, and the Bills just don't have an answer. I think this year the Bills actually have the advantage on the defensive side, so I'm going to pick them. I just don't trust these Kansas City receivers to create separation down the field when it matters, and I like Travis Kelce, still one of the best tight ends in football, if not easily the best, but he's losing a step, and I think the Bills are finally going to take advantage of that, and I hate picking the Bills because, as you mentioned, Patrick Mahomes always seems to run these plays that just absolutely bust their defense open. But I still think the Bills are the better team, and I think that was shown in the regular season. I mean, this game is likely going to be another high-scoring thriller. Whatever it is, I'm taking the over. But I do think Josh Allen finally puts a win over Kansas City under his belt and leads this team to an AFC championship. And I really just think it's due time. It's going to be in Buffalo, as you mentioned, in Orchard Park, as opposed to in Arrowhead. I think that's a big advantage on the Bills side. So I'm going to roll with them, and I think Bills fans will be happy that I'm finally picking them to succeed.
Yeah, I think it's going to be another great game. I don't think we've really ever seen a bad game between these two teams. But now going over to the NFC, I know you have the 49ers versus the Eagles in the first game. How do you see that one going?
I actually have the 49ers over the
Oh,
Rams. That's going to be
yeah,
a
the
tough game.
Rams.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know. That's a big upset. People might be surprised about that. And, as I was saying earlier, another divisional rivalry, and I already kind of spoiled it. 49ers over the Rams. I think it's going to be pretty easy there. I do think the Rams are one of those flashy teams that could go out and beat a team like Detroit. When you put them against the 49ers that have all these weapons, I think it's almost impossible. The Rams just don't have playmakers on the outside of their defense. They have a great interior D-line. They have some underrated linebackers, but at the end of the day, you get CMC in space, you get Deebo Samuel in space, you get Brandon Ayuk in space. 49ers are going to absolutely dominate those matchups. And as much as I like Sean McVay, I also think they just have the coaching matchup. And the Rams have not had a good track record against the 49ers with Sean McVay as coach. Kind of seems to be their kryptonite. I think the 49ers make this kind of easy work and go to the NFC Championship.
Yeah, and I have them going up against the Bucks. I think a pretty easy game, better offensively, better defensively. I think they should be able to run away with that game pretty easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And going on to my last matchup in the NFC for the divisional round, I have the Cowboys versus the Eagles. Again, divisional rivals, the NFC East. And I'm going to be honest, this is where things get crazy for me. These two teams split the season series. They're 1-1. And in their last matchup, we saw the Cowboys dominate at home. Obviously, this game would be in Arlington. It would be home for the Cowboys. But I think we have seen the Cowboys always find a way to choke in the postseason. And going against the Eagles, who will have the best possible game plan against them than any team will. They've seen them the most. They're prepped for this game. I think the Cowboys could get caught lacking. And with emotions running high, I do think the Eagles win this game. They're a team that's obviously limped into the playoffs. They've struggled, but they have the talent to beat the Cowboys. They're not a team that on paper is much worse. If anything, they're arguably better. Based on what I've seen from Philly, even in their struggles, is that when the game gets high scoring in shootouts, they always find a way to score at the end of the game. That Buffalo game really stands out to me. Buffalo is probably a better team than Philly, but Philly was able to run down the field and clutch it out in overtime. I think if it goes like that against the Cowboys, I expect a similar result. I like the Eagles maybe more than I should. Are they a real contender? We'll see when we talk about them next, but I do think they could go out and beat the Cowboys, and I think this will go down as another collapse for Dallas.
I also have Dallas here. They're going to be going up against Detroit. As we know, that last game, a lot going on against the Lions. They want to go out there and get their revenge against Dallas. But Dallas has been great all year, and it kind of hurts me, but I just don't really see them losing at home. They've been fantastic all year at home. I think the Lions just not as good, and if it's going to come down to coaching in the end, I think, and just overall players in the end, Dan Campbell, a pretty good coach. I think he's been able to get his teammates and the rest of his team rallying around him. But I think Dallas should be able to come away with this win at home, even though it does hurt me to say that they may be going to an NFC championship for the first time in what feels like forever.
Yeah, I mean Dallas is a good team. It would have paid me to move them forward, but I kind of copped out. I don't think they're actually NFC championship contenders, but talking about these championship games, let's start with the AFC. Obviously, you're going to have the Ravens and the Chiefs. I'm going to have the Ravens and the Bills. So, we'll start with you. Do you think the Chiefs make it back to the Super Bowl again, or is it Lamar's year?
I think from what we've seen so far this year, I think the Ravens are the best team in the NFL. And I know that the Chiefs are going to come out here and be very aggressive. They're going to try to win this game, having another AFC championship. But I think in the end, they're just going to fall a little bit short. This team is not as skilled or as well built as Baltimore. And I think we could be getting pretty close to that Harbaugh parlay.
Yeah, and obviously we just saw Michigan win the national championship. So the Harbaugh parlay is alive. I have them going against the Bills, and I have a similar sentiment. I mean, the Ravens have looked like the best team in football. You don't get the one seed on accident. They've been really, really solid this year. And more importantly, as I mentioned, that Ravens defense has looked incredible. They go up against Josh Allen, who I mostly have good things to say about, but as we mentioned a couple of times, he's very turnover prone. The Ravens defense loves to cause turnovers, kind of just a recipe for disaster, especially with the game being in Baltimore. Ravens are simply better at most aspects of the game. I think that's reflected in the score. I think it could be very close. Obviously, we're getting the 1 and the 2 seed in the AFC up against each other. Always bound to be a good game, but I do think Baltimore's better. I would take them as well.
Yeah, and in the NFC Championship, we're both going to have a 49ers versus NFC East matchup with the Eagles and the Cowboys here. The 49ers beating both of these teams, beating the Eagles 42-19 earlier in the season, beating the Cowboys 42-10 earlier in the season. Do you see this going the same way? Maybe the same team winning, a different outcome, or is it just going to be a beatdown on one end?
Maybe not a beatdown. If the Eagles do actually win 2 playoff games, they beat the Bucks on the road, they beat the Cowboys on the road. I think the 49ers fans should be a little bit worried that they're going to do the same thing over in San Francisco. But with that being said, we've already seen this matchup, as you mentioned. San Francisco came out on top. I don't think it will be as convincing. Getting 40 points dropped on you in the NFC Championship would be kind of brutal, but I do have the 49ers winning as well. I'm going for the boring best team in the AFC, best team in the NFC Super Bowl, but I really think that's what we're seeing this year. I think this is unlike most years where I truly do believe that the two best teams in football, one's in the AFC, one's in the NFC. I think those are the Super Bowl contenders. If the 49ers play the Eagles at the end of the day, I think the luck will run out. We've seen Philadelphia be shaky all year. Who's to say they don't match up against one of the premier offenses and defenses in the league against San Francisco and crumble? I could easily see that happen. So I think the 49ers make it, and that makes my Super Bowl Ravens v 49ers.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, the 49ers being able to take care of the Cowboys earlier this season pretty handedly. Like you said, the 49ers, the best team in the NFC this year, moving on to the championship. But I think it's going to go a different way in the NFC Championship, unfortunately. I think if there's been a Cowboys team to go to the Super Bowl, which this doesn't feel great as a Giants fan to say that I think the Cowboys are going to the Super Bowl. I could easily have just said they could have lost earlier, but this team this year with CeeDee Lamb, who has emerged as one of the best wide receivers in the NFL recently, and the 49ers, I mean, they got checked by the Ravens and Brock Purdy. I know you guys know my opinion on him. I don't think he'll be able to get it done in the big game. He's going up against Dak Prescott, which we haven't really seen, but Dak Prescott, not my favorite quarterback, but I think he's a guy that obviously does get a lot of hate at the end of the day. He's probably not the best quarterback in the NFL by any stance, but he had 3 interceptions against the 49ers earlier this year. He ended the season with only 9. So, I mean, having a third of them in that game, he's been great this year. And he really is the definition if we're looking at a game manager quarterback. A guy like him, he does enough to get this team to win. And I think they're going to be able to get by the 49ers. I know both of these teams, both of these fan bases, some of the biggest and strongest in the NFL right now. So either way, I mean, this is one of those rivalries, very big in the past, especially especially in the 90s. But I think the Cowboys, unfortunately, might be going to the Super Bowl for the first time in however long since black and white.
And as you mentioned, we are now at the Super Bowl. I have the Ravens and the 49ers, Ravens Cowboys for Banning. So I'll start with myself because if you guys don't know, Banning's a big Giants fan. So hearing him put the Cowboys in the Super Bowl is pretty exciting for me. I want to hear what he has to say, but I'll keep it simple. I have Ravens versus 49ers, and I think the NFL fans will be very happy to see the Super Bowl matchup once again. It's been 10 years since we saw these two match up in the big game. And this game will be highlighted by plenty of offensive studs, plenty of defensive studs on both sides, really just a high level of talent on the field. But as we always say, I think the Super Bowl does come down to the quarterback matchup. And will you have your statements on Brock Purdy? I actually like Brock Purdy quite a bit, but he is no Lamar Jackson. You know, we're in a year where Lamar Jackson will win the MVP award, and it would only make sense for him to cap off that insane season with the Super Bowl MVP as well. I would have the Ravens winning the Super Bowl against the 49ers. It would definitely be an exciting game. There could be a potential for a lot of offense in it, but with two teams with equal superpower on both sides, going to roll with the Ravens and Lamar Jackson. I think it would be an incredible game, but I think the Ravens are easily a team that would match up well in this game and just go out and win it.
Yeah, and like you said, the Ravens have been really good all year, and the Cowboys have been too. But unfortunately, Lamar Jackson will have to go out here and win the Super Bowl, have 200 rushing yards, throw for 300 yards offensively. We'll bring the Cowboys out to the Super Bowl just to watch them lose it in the end. I think the Ravens the best team either way. I think pretty much whoever they go up against in the playoffs, I would feel pretty comfortable. We saw them going up against the 49ers earlier this year, and they were able to capitalize. This defense, I think, was very underrated by a lot of people before. Guys like Kyle Hamilton have came out this year and played fantastic. I know when he was drafted, one of those guys that was arguably one of the best players in the draft, but because he was a safety, he didn't get drafted as high as if he was a wide receiver or a cornerback, just because of that position. But he's been fantastic everywhere in the secondary this year, even playing like outside middle linebacker. He's been the definition of a strong safety this year. He's been great. But the 49ers, or sorry, the Cowboys, I just don't think get it done. If we're, like you said, in the Super Bowl, it seems like the better quarterback wins 99% of the time. Sometimes if the team with the worst quarterback has a team that's built very well in the end, like a team like the 49ers, who I would say Brock Purdy, not as good as a guy like Lamar Jackson, but that team is built very well. So sometimes you can get by, but in the end, I think the Ravens are going to win against the Cowboys.
Yeah, I mean, Banning and I took a lot of different ways to get here, but we both have the Ravens winning the Super Bowl. Probably not to surprise anyone at home, but there's so many narratives in this playoffs. There's so many competitive teams, and this is the most parity we've seen in the league for a long time. I mean, seems like the last 4 or 5 years, it's just the safe pick to say the Chiefs are going to win it, and it's a big story this year, and it's a lot different. So with that being said, I mean, there's a lot to look forward to, a lot of huge games, and let us know down in the comments if you agree with our predictions or not. I feel pretty good about mine, but we'll see what happens in the end.
Yeah, and either way, I mean, like we always say, a lot of these predictions will probably end up being wrong, but we'll tell you what happens if we actually are right in the end. And in both of our scenarios, too, something interesting to point out, if you're a Ravens fan, if they do end up winning the Super Bowl this year, winning a championship in 2000, 2010, and then the 2020s, pretty good consistency wise, having a bunch of different quarterbacks in that time period. So obviously, a team like that you want to look out for having consistency over the decades. Lamar Jackson looking to build onto his resume, and pretty much all of these teams. I mean, if we're talking about teams like the Bills, the Chiefs, even a team like the Texans or the Browns, I think could come out here with a surprise. I know you had the Rams winning in the first round. A team like the Eagles, who just made the Super Bowl last year, they're going through a lot right now, but they're still one of the best teams in the league, so they could come out on top in the end. I think we're in for a very good playoffs. This wild card round may not be the most exciting. I think we could easily just see most of the chalk matchups end up winning and not really be too surprised about it. But I think after that, whoever's left in the divisional round, I think we should have some great games.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to look forward to. Hope you guys appreciated the video, had a fun time making it, and we'll catch you in the next one.
And we'll see you then.